this yourself, and if you don't have a like super typical anime art style and you have thicker lines, I definitely think the rotator might be more of your friend, just because the warping and the deforming can really mess with the quality of your line, and you will see that when I try to animate the blink. I would say that is the hardest part for me personally with this process, because none of the tutorials could really help me with the problems I was having because their sample models were in such different styles. So up until this point, the hardest part of doing all the rigging was that subtle rotation of sort of the torso and the skirt area. That was all about to change. All of the stuff I had done up until now, other than that initial rotation, was basically just adding in rotation joints and doing very, very subtle like warps and just moving stuff around. Like her eyebrows were so easy. All you really had to do was move them around a little bit and change the angle slightly, and it was going to allow her to emote in all these different ways. I did accidentally pop her head off a couple times, but you know, it do be like that sometimes. But around this point is where things started to get a little bit tricky, because as soon as I was done with, like, say, the tilting of the head from side to side, I had to do something that was a lot more complicated, which actually involved changing the angles of the face. Now, the way that you do this is you link together the X and the Y parts, and it creates this weird little grid that is a lot more elaborate than the sort of like binary options that you get with like the body and stuff. So I just followed along with, again, the tutorial and also the sample model to try to figure out how this exactly worked, and I realized that each of these quadrants are kind of just the direction that your character's facing. So this is going to allow your VTuber model to actually like look up into the side, look down into the side. You get the picture. This I'm gonna paint you guys a real picture. This was hellish. This was absolutely nightmarish. Like, trying to figure out a way to just move her face and warp her face so that it looked like she was looking around was frankly, it was Lovecraftian. Every time I moved each little piece of her face, it looked horrifying. She looked so like messed up. I thought I was never gonna get it right. It was the first time in this whole process that I felt like I would rather just actually hand animate it, but I eventually figured it out. The way that I basically dealt with it was that I would use a very delicate and very careful sort of perspective-y warp on the like facial features. I would scooch over the backing face. I would scooch over the front tendrils and the bangs all together. I would just move them without warping or anything. And then I would do some careful warping to move her chin under where her mouth would end up with that like weird perspective warp. The last thing that helped the most, I would say, with making a convincing like turn of the head in both directions is to move the nose, just like to grab it and move it. I thought I was going to have to like warp and change the shape of the nose, but because it's so small and because of like my art style, I felt like actually just leaving it alone and just carefully moving it was the most important thing. Now, the reason you want to do that separate from the warping on the face is because presumably the nose is sticking out more than the eyes and the mouth, which means that when she turns her head, it should be moving over way more than her mouth and her eyes. This gives a much more three-dimensional look, and it is the secret sauce on how I actually got this to work. Her horn was a huge pain in the butt though. Figuring out how to move it along with her raising her face and lowering it and turning was really counter to what I would have thought initially, and I really, again, like my brain was just like, if my brain was a computer, the fans would be on like all the way. It would sound like a MacBook running Minecraft with shaders or something. Like, it was just like I was focusing so hard. I didn't even realize how much time had passed. I literally did all of this rigging in one day, which I do not recommend. Frankly, you guys, I only stopped for like quick junk food meals, and then it was back on the computer immediately. I started rigging at like 4 p.m.-ish, and I didn't stop until well past midnight, which is not healthy for you. Frankly, don't do that. Anyway, health tips aside, I did come up with some useful tips as far as moving the eyes around so that it looks more convincing. When you're moving the iris part, it's really easy to just like grab and move it to the left and right and up and down and just sort of leave it at that. But I recommend doing both a move and a slight warp. This will make their eye look a little bit more like actual spherical. If at the farthest point of her looking left or right, if you warp the actual shape of the iris a little bit and curve it a little bit so that it looks like it's actually following the curve of her eye, I found that had a pretty profound effect despite it being a relatively easy and small little edit. So definitely give that a try if you're trying to make your own VTuber. Again, your sort of mileage with this technique is going to change based on the style that you draw the eye in, and I had a lot of problems with the way that I drew the eyes and my art style, particularly now when it was time to animate the blink. Now I was kind of dreading this part because I thought it might be hard, and I was correct. So what you're going to do now is not a warp or a rotate. This is called a deform path, and this is the final boss of rigging. So this one's a lot different because you actually click on the actual texture. So this is the actual texture of her top eyelid, and then you place all of these little deform dots on the parts that you want to deform, and then you can kind of just move them and keyframe them. But it ended up causing a lot of problems for me because unlike your typical VTuber who has a less intense curve over the eyelid, mine is really dramatic because it's this cartoony art style. And so as I moved the dots down, they were getting closer together because her eye is very not flat at the top. So as I was moving them down, it was just absolutely crunching this line to pieces, and I was so confused as to how I could make it look more smooth. Plus, with the eye spikes of the lower eyelid, I was having a really hard time making it look like her eye was properly closed. I ended up actually really liking how it turned out, but my gosh, I was having to fiddle with it for so long, just trying to make it look natural or smooth. One of the good parts to consider if you're stressing about this part, and what I should have realized while I was working on it, is that the blinks are going to be relatively fast, so you don't have to make them perfect. Now, obviously, if her eyes are going to be closed for a minute, it might look kind of ugly, but also I was zoomed in way more than I needed to be. So by the time she's actually in use, I feel like the blink's gonna look fine, but I still think this might be a part that I want to edit and change a little bit more later. So once I got her blink done on the one side, I had to move her to the other, and it was just as much of a pain as the first one. I also realized that there were some problems with her actual face texture, which I'm going to have to change, but I couldn't even deal with that at the moment, so I was just trying to get through the blink. Now you can see her backs of her eyes, the actual eye part below the sort of eyeliner part is not moving alongside this deform path, which was a little bit stressful. But all you basically do here is you just take the inside of the eye part, which hopefully you've made a folder for, and you just squash it all down to follow the eyeline. And amazingly, this program does a pretty good job of filling in the gaps and keeping everything where it belongs. The hardest part again is definitely the fully closed blink, just because you smash so much of so much texture into one tiny little line. And same problem with the mouth. It was a little bit easier, but all I had was one open mouth and one closed mouth, and you actually have to hide the closed mouth on the edge of the lip of the open mouth, which I think is super funny. But this is a better technique, I think, than what I did with the eyes, which was basically to create my own closed eye image out of nothing, out of just the pieces of the open eye, which I don't know, it turned out okay, but it's not the best. I think that actually having a closed eye and a closed mouth that you sneak alongside the open one is a better way to get it all figured out. So in here is the physics menu, and this is where I got really excited because this is where you can kind of test everything and you can add sort of in-program physics, which is really amazing. So this is where I added in all the move parts, which are basically her tag, as well as her hair and her, it ended up being her sleeves as well because I wanted them to sway. So anything you add in here, they're going to have an automatic sort of preset physics style with it. There's like long hair, short hair, like chest physics, all pre-figured out for you. And honestly, look how good they end up looking. I was so scared of this menu because I really didn't understand the physics part and it just sounded hard, but it's the simplest thing ever. You basically just add in the layers you want the physics to affect and then they have the preset. That's all you really have to do. So it ended up being really simple. For some reason, one side of her hair was like way stiffer than the other. Like the scale part, the scale number was way lower than the other side of her hair. So I ended up actually just increasing the output, or yeah, the output for everything. And it's kind of like ended up like maxed out, and that made it way more responsive and it just looked really, really good by the end of it. I was so happy, especially with her tag and the way that her face looks as she's moving around. I was thinking it was very questionable looking when I was doing all of these presets and all these things I was trying to set up. I thought they looked kind of weird and like I was doing a bad job, but when everything's moving together, it's a lot more convincing. So you can be a little less hard on yourself than maybe you initially would be. And yeah, I can't wait to see her actually in motion with a motion tracker. Now, this whole process, the making of the final model as well as the rigging, took so much longer than I expected. Like the rigging itself, I had one sort of like sitting down for it and it ended up taking about 9 hours straight just of nonstop work. So we are probably going to have a part 3. Please forgive me for that. And yeah, thank you so much for watching to the end of this extremely long video. If you've made it all the way